This video is a tribute and an in-depth analysis of El Eternauta, one of the most important works of Argentine and Latin American culture. We explore its historical context, its social symbolism, and the impact it had on generations of readers, culminating in its highly anticipated Netflix series adaptation. Don't miss our upcoming stories. If you love stories that combine mystery, history, and a powerful message, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Join the conversation. Tell us in the comments, what would you do if it started snowing in your city tomorrow? Would you fight alone or seek to join others? They say great stories aren't just read, they're felt. But there's one in particular, born in Argentina, that isn't just felt, it's breathed. Because it's not fiction, it's a warning. It's not fantasy, it's a mirror. And maybe, just maybe, you're already living inside it without knowing it. One random night, while a group of friends were playing truco in a house in Vicente Lopez, it started to snow. But this wasn't an ordinary snowfall. It was white, yes. Silent, too. But every flake was death. What seemed like a natural phenomenon became the first symptom of an invisible invasion. Thus begins El Eternauta, the masterpiece that many try to erase, but that always returns, because it warns, because it disturbs, and because it hasn't yet fully come true. What if I told you that this story isn't just a comic but a prophecy? What if I told you that its author disappeared for saying too much, too soon? Today, you're going to discover why El Eternauta isn't just fiction. It is memory, it is resistance, it is future. Discover the full story of El Eternauta, Héctor Germán Oesterheld's masterpiece that became a prophecy. This isn't just a summary of a comic. It's a profound journey into the hidden political message, the tragic disappearance of its author during the Argentine dictatorship, and the rebirth of the legend with a Netflix series starring Ricardo Darín. In this narrated documentary, we explore why El Eternauta is much more than a science fiction comic. We analyze the invasion and the deadly snowfall as a powerful metaphor for oppression, the birth of the collective hero, and how the creative duo of Oesterheld and Solano López forever changed national comics. You'll understand why they tried to censor it and why its message of resistance is more relevant today than ever. The mystery begins with snow, the first sign of the end. It all began with something so simple, so innocent, that no one could have suspected what was coming. A snowfall, but not one of those that brings joy, cold, or white landscapes. This snowfall was different. It falls slowly, silently, but every flake that touches the skin kills. Buenos Aires, 1950s. In an ordinary house, in a neighborhood like any other, a group of friends plays truco. They laugh, argue, distract themselves from the world. And then, someone approaches the window. It's snowing outside. A surprise, yes, because it doesn't snow in Buenos Aires. But the strangest thing isn't the snow, it's the silence. No cars are heard, no voices, no sirens, just emptiness. Juan Salvo, the protagonist, soon notices the strangeness of the phenomenon. Looking more closely, he discovers that the flakes kill those who touch them. Neighbors fall to the ground. Cars stop. Entire families frozen in death. And so, what seemed like a climatic accident becomes the first sign of an invasion. The snowfall isn't just a comic strip device. It's a metaphor for the invisible that can kill us. Control, repression, fear that falls without us noticing, and that only those who wake up can avoid. A hero without a cape, the birth of the Eternauta. In every tragedy, a figure is born. But it's not always a hero with a cape, powers, or epic lines. Sometimes, it's simply someone who decides to act when everyone else freezes. In the Eternauta, that someone was Juan Salvo. After understanding that snow kills, Salvo makes a crucial decision to protect his family, his wife Elena, and his daughter Martita. With what he has at home, plastic, rubber, makeshift mask, she builds an isolation suit, not to go fight, but to go out and search for answers, to survive. The suit becomes his armor, but also his condemnation. It's the boundary between inside and outside, between what remains of humanity and what has already been taken over by horror. And when one crosses that door, he doesn't do so as a hero. He does so as an ordinary man facing the unknown. That's where the Eternauta is born. Not when he saves someone, not when he leads, but when he chooses not to give up. His power isn't strength, nor knowledge, it's willpower. And that's the hidden message of the work. The true hero isn't the one who can, but the one who decides. One walks through an empty city. The faces on the streets are frozen in expressions of surprise. Each step takes him further away from the world he knew. And as his friends begin to design more suits, the group becomes a survival cell. They are no longer victims. They are witnesses. They are the last ones left. The invisible enemy, the invasion no one saw coming. Until that moment, everything seemed like a natural tragedy, a lethal snowfall, an inexplicable phenomenon. But what Juan Salvo and his group discover is that they are not alone. Outside, something is watching them. Something is controlling them. First, the soulless bodies appear. Humans who walk without will, without looking to the sides. They are the robot men, victims of a technology that dominates the mind. Behind them, the cascarudos emerge, lumbering, armored creatures shaped like giant insects. Then, the gerbos, swift, agile beasts, like living tanks guided by remote control. And beyond, in the shadows, the true puppeteers, the hands. Beings with a key deformity, hands full of fingers, capable of handling multiple devices, who are not the masters of the plan either, because they too obey. The structure of domination in the Eternauta is no coincidence. Each creature represents a level of subjugation, from the willless humans to the leaders who are also subjugated. It's a fierce critique of authoritarianism, of the systems that destroy from within, of the fear that transforms people into weapons. The city becomes a battlefield, but no armies are seen. There are no tanks or planes, only faceless creatures and humans in makeshift suits, resisting with what little they have. The enemy doesn't come from outer space. It comes from control, manipulation, indifference. Juan Salvo understands that this isn't an invasion, it's an occupation, and that the only way out is to resist. Human resistance, the collective hero. As the deadly snowfall and creatures dominated Buenos Aires, Juan Salvo understood something key. He wouldn't survive alone. And just as the Eternauta was born, another idea was also born, more powerful. That of resisting together, in community, in a group, in humanity. In a city plunged into silence and fear, cells of survivors began to emerge. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other now shared resources. Entire families organized. There were no charismatic leaders, no individual heroes. There were ordinary men and women who made extraordinary decisions. Therein lay the strength of the Eternauta. Oesterheld broke all the molds of the time. In a world plagued by superheroes with superhuman powers, he presented something revolutionary. The collective hero, not one, but many. Not one who saves everyone, but everyone saving each other. Because in great tragedies, the true miracle isn't having power, it's staying human. The story shows how Juan Salvo, Favalli, Lucas, and the others begin to coordinate, plan, and fight, not for glory, but for survival. It's in these moments that the comic becomes more than fiction. It becomes a mirror, because it poses an essential question. What would you do if the impossible became real? Would you hide? Would you flee? Or would you be part of the resistance? El Eternauta isn't a story of great deeds. It's a story of small decisions with enormous consequences. Sharing food, protecting others, not giving up. The epic isn't in the explosions, it's in the connection. And perhaps that's why it struck such a deep chord in Argentina. Because, at its core, this comic was about us. About ordinary people. About those people who time and again had to rise up in the midst of darkness. And they did. Editorial Frontera and the birth of Argentine comics. Sometimes, for a story to change the world, it needs a place to be born. El Eternauta wasn't the product of a major foreign publisher. It was a brave decision, an almost artisanal act. In 1957, Héctor Germán Oesterheld and his brother Jorge founded Editorial Frontera. And from that corner of Buenos Aires, they would challenge the publishing model of an entire era. Frontera was created with a single goal: creative freedom. Oesterheld wanted to tell stories that wouldn't have to go through commercial filters or ideological censorship. He wanted to make Argentine comics with their own voices, recognizable faces, and real streets. And that's why, instead of generic aliens, he brought to life invaders stepping onto Rivadavia Avenue. Instead of Supermen, he showed neighborhood residents resisting with what they had. The first publication in which El Eternauta appeared was the Hora Cero Weekly Supplement. It was a landscape booklet, barely 16 pages long, printed in black and white. It cost 1 peso and 50 cents. And yet, it concealed one of the most powerful stories ever written on the continent. Frontera wasn't just a publishing house, it was a cultural trench. While the country lived in fear, amid dictatorships, proscriptions, and silence, the pages of Frontera spoke of courage, community, and warnings disguised as science fiction. The creation of Frontera was, in itself, a political act. Not partisan, but profoundly human. Oesterheld didn't just write to entertain. He wrote to sow doubt, to disturb, to awaken. And that's why he needed a space where no one would tell him how to tell his truth. This search for autonomy marked the birth of Argentine national comics as we know them. Comics with identity, with ideology, with uncomfortable questions, and with an ambition that went beyond paper, to change the consciousness of those who read them. Invasion as a metaphor, the hidden political message. At first glance, El Eternauta was a science fiction story. Alien invasions, monstrous creatures, deadly snow. But for those who knew how to look beyond the drawings, there was something hidden. A message, a disguised warning, a map of repression drawn between vignettes. Oesterheld published El Eternauta in 1957, just 2 years after the coup d'etat that overthrew Juan Domingo Perón. Argentina was going through a dark time. The so-called liberating revolution brought with it executions, persecutions, and proscriptions. Fear was the true, invisible snowfall, and that snow also killed. The invasion in El Eternauta didn't come from space. It came from power, from control, from blind obedience. The robot men represented those who carried out orders without thinking. The hands, those who managed terror from the shadows, and the real invaders were faceless. They were the logic of the system. The most disturbing thing was that no one said it out loud, not even Oesterheld. But they knew, he, the readers, and also those who didn't want this to be understood. Because true power isn't afraid of noise. It's afraid of symbols. It's afraid of thought. It's afraid of a comic strip that can open your eyes without raising its voice. Solano López, the cartoonist, said years later, many interpreted it as a premonition of the Peronist resistance. But the truth is that El Eternauta spoke of all forms of resistance, of any human group that organizes when they want to silence it. It was, in essence, an act of anticipated memory. Perhaps that's why it was so uncomfortable. Because readers didn't need it explained to them. They felt it. The snow, the confinement, the bodies lining the streets. Everything was familiar. Because although the story spoke of the future, it unfolded in the present, and it couldn't be ignored. Oesterheld and Solano López, the duo that changed everything. Behind every great story, there are two fires that sustain it: imagination and the stroke. In the case of El Eternauta, those fires had first and last names: Héctor Germán Oesterheld and Francisco Solano López. Two different men, two complementary passions, and a single mission: to tell what no one dared to tell. Oesterheld wasn't a screenwriter by profession. He was a geologist, a scientist trained at the University of Buenos Aires, passionate about mineralogy and the secrets of the earth. His rational mind, combined with a unique literary sensibility, allowed him to construct complex yet believable worlds. Worlds where the impossible made sense, where the fantastic hurt like reality. Francisco Solano López, for his part, came from pure drawing. The grandson of Paraguay's first constitutional president, he had art in his blood. His stroke wasn't just technical. It was narrative, dramatic, with soul. It was he who proposed creating a science fiction series, but a realistic one, set in Buenos Aires, with familiar sidewalks, unlit streetlights, and recognizable faces. That was the true birth of El Eternauta. Not in a script, nor in a cartoon, but in an agreement between two creators who wanted to break with the established order. Together, they created more than just a comic strip. They created a living metaphor, a story where every dialogue was measured, every gesture charged with a message, and where each character reflected a segment of society. They were architects of a resistance disguised as entertainment. Oesterheld's house in Bekaa became a creative sanctuary. There, he hosted cartoonists, writers, and friends. They discussed politics, philosophy, and science. It was a cultural laboratory in an Argentina that was becoming increasingly dangerous for those who thought differently. The hidden and censored versions of El Eternauta. Sometimes, when a story is too uncomfortable, they try to erase it. That's what happened to El Eternauta, because what began as a science fiction comic became too real. And power doesn't forgive when fiction tells the truth before its time. In 1969, Oesterheld decided to rewrite the story, this time with the master Alberto Breccia. The new version was different, darker, more symbolic, with an almost experimental approach that broke with everything seen before, but also more political. The message was no longer hidden. It was direct, raw, defiant. It lasted only 17 issues. It was published in Gente magazine and abruptly cancelled. The excuse? That it wasn't liked. The reality? That it was annoying. The country was under surveillance, and a comic that spoke of control, oppression, and resistance was too dangerous to continue circulating. But it wasn't the only one. There was also a lost chapter, El Atajo, published years later by the National Library, and there were attempts at animation that remained pilots, fragmented versions, scattered files, a story torn apart by censorship, but never silenced. Every attempt to erase El Eternauta only made it stronger, because when a work touches the profound truth of a people, no censorship is enough. Silence, sometimes, screams louder than 1,000 words. Censorship in a democracy, persecution in a dictatorship, everything seemed to point to the same goal, erasing El Eternauta from the collective consciousness. But they didn't succeed. On the contrary, every attempt to silence him made him immortal. The price of truth, the disappearance of Oesterheld and his family. Héctor Germán Oesterheld didn't just write about resistance, he lived it, and he paid for it with his life. In 1977, during Argentina's last military dictatorship, he was kidnapped by the armed forces. So were his 4 daughters. All of them disappeared. 2 of them were pregnant. Oesterheld had gone from writing metaphors to writing denunciations. In El Eternauta II, published in 1976, the enemies were no longer symbolic aliens. They were military men. They were accomplices of terror. And that, in that context, was a verdict. He joined the Montoneros. He believed in a just, free, and united homeland. He dictated his scripts from hiding. He communicated by telephone. He wrote knowing it could be his last day, until it was. He was last seen at the El Vesubio clandestine center. He was never heard from again. The only survivor was his wife, Elsa Sanchez. His grandson, born in captivity, is still being sought by human rights organizations. Oesterheld was not a martyr. He was an ordinary man with unwavering convictions. His life intersected with his work. His Eternauta was his own destiny. A solitary traveler facing darkness, without giving in, without surrendering. The Eternauta was no longer just a comic strip. It was a testimony, a stifled cry, a map of warnings. The life of its author gave the work a dimension that no script could have written. The Netflix adaptation and the rebirth of a legend. For years, many dreamed of bringing the Eternauta to the screen. But it wasn't until 2025 that Netflix made it a reality. Under the direction of Bruno Stagnaro and starring Ricardo Darín as Juan Salvo, the story took on new life and it became a global phenomenon. Nothing was a coincidence. Darín was born the same year the first episode was published, 1957. The Eternauts costume, far from being stylized, was designed faithfully to the original comic. Heavy, uncomfortable, real, authentic gamulanes were used. A wall was built with real cars. 5 different types of snow were designed, all to respect the spirit of the work. Oesterheld's grandson participated as a creative consultant. Each scene was revised with respect for the legacy, and something incredible happened. The Eternauta not only adapted, it once again spoke to the present. It became necessary again. New generations learned about Juan Salvo, but also about the story of its creator. The series revived the search for the missing grandchildren. It brought back issues that some wanted to forget, as if the character had returned to complete the mission. The Eternauta returned, and he returned with a vengeance, in every language, on every continent. But there was even more to it, because it wasn't just a story of invasion. It was also a lesson in science, in spirit, and in inner resilience. Between science and emotion, the geological, philosophical, and spiritual influence. Many don't know it, but the Eternauta was written by a geologist. Héctor Germán Oesterheld didn't come from the world of fiction. He came from the world of rocks, minerals, the earth itself. And that is evident in every line. The precision with which he describes the insulating suits, the composition of the air, the physical and chemical reactions. Everything has a scientific logic, but also it has a soul. Because Oesterheld didn't just understand the physical world, he understood the emotional world, the philosophical world, the spiritual world. The story speaks of synchronicities, of collective decisions, of emotional resilience. It speaks of not giving up in the face of the inevitable, of choosing the common good over individual survival, of maintaining hope in the midst of ice. The Eternauta is not just science fiction. It's a parable about the awakening of consciousness, about the need to see beyond the visible, about the true power of ordinary people when they decide not to give up. The play's deepest message isn't in the creatures, it's in the decisions, in the way an ordinary person can become a symbol, and in how a community can be saved if it stays together. The eternal legacy, why this story lives on, and more timely than ever. Almost 70 years have passed since the first snowfall, since Juan Salvo set out in his makeshift suit, since Oesterheld wrote his warning disguised as science fiction, and yet the Eternauta is still alive, more than ever, because the invisible threat is still there, because the silent control continues to mutate, and because there are still those who want us to stop resisting, but also because there are still Eternauts, people who fight, who protect, who awaken. Today, the Eternauta is not just a comic strip, nor a series. It is a symbol, it is memory, it is the future. It is proof that a good story can change the soul of a country, that a drawn character can open more eyes than 1,000 speeches. And now that you know the whole story, the final question is for you. What would you do if it starts snowing tomorrow? If silence takes over your city? What if you realize the invasion has already begun, but no one wants to see it? Because all these signs have one thing in common. They're there to wake you up. They're not a coincidence. The question is, are you going to continue ignoring them? Or are you going to start listening to the universe?